August 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. The sun hammered down on the barbed wire fence like a judge's gavel. 12 German women stepped off the back of a dusty army truck, blinking against the glare, their gray uniforms hanging loose on frames that looked more like coat racks than soldiers. They had crossed an ocean expecting punishment. Instead, a rancher in a sweat-stained Stetson looked them over with a frown that seemed almost sad, shook his head slowly, and said words that made no sense at all. "You're too thin to work." Before we dive into this incredible true story, hit like and subscribe so you never miss these untold chapters of history. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from: Texas, Germany, anywhere. I read every one. Now let's get back to the moment that changed everything for these women. Because what happened next on that ranch didn't just break every rule in the Army manual, it shattered every lie the Nazi propaganda machine had told them about America. And in that first bewildering moment, standing in the Texas heat, while the Cowboys said they were too weak to be useful, they began to realize that everything they thought they knew about the enemy was about to unravel. To understand how 12 German servicewomen ended up on a cattle ranch learning to ride horses instead of breaking rocks in a labor camp, you have to rewind 6 months earlier to the blistering heat of North Africa. In early 1944, the Afrika Korps was collapsing under the weight of Allied armor and air superiority. British and American forces swept across Tunisia, capturing not just soldiers but entire support units, field hospitals, communications posts, supply depots. Among the thousands of prisoners taken were these 12 women, nurses, radio operators, clerks. They had never fired a shot in anger, but they wore the uniform of the Third Reich, and that was enough to make them enemies. From the moment of capture, terror walked beside them like a shadow. For years, Goebbels' propaganda ministry had painted a picture of Allied brutality that would make medieval torturers blush. American soldiers, they were told, were savage, godless men who would starve prisoners, work them to death or worse. One woman named Greta later wrote in her diary, "We believed we would be treated worse than animals. We thought we would never see home again." The cruel irony was that they were more afraid of the people who would feed them better than their own collapsing army ever could. They were loaded onto a transport ship in a North African port that reeked of diesel fuel and rotting fish. Below deck, the air was thick and stifling, the steel walls slick with condensation. Hammocks swung in tight rows as the engines thrummed a constant metallic heartbeat. The food was strange to them, white bread instead of dark rye, watery coffee, thin soup, but it was more than many German civilians were seeing by 1944. Still, the women continued to lose weight. One of them, a clerk named Lisa, remembered thinking, "If this is the beginning, how will we survive the end?" The convoy crossed over 3,000 miles of Atlantic in just under 3 weeks. Occasionally they were allowed on deck in small guarded groups, where salt winds slapped their faces, and they saw the industrial might of America's war machine stretching to the horizon, dozens of ships, moving in formation, a convoy so vast it looked like a floating city. When the American coastline finally appeared, it didn't look like the bombed-out ruins of Europe. It looked impossibly whole. Cranes towered over busy docks. Warehouses lined the waterfront. And in the distance, faint through the harbor haze, they could see tall buildings and factory smoke. One woman later recalled, "We looked at that harbor and thought, how can we be winning a war against a country that looks like this?" From the port, they were loaded onto trains and sent inland. Through dirty windows, they watched an America that seemed impossible. Endless fields of green and gold rolled past. Small towns flashed by with shops full of goods, gas stations with lines of shiny cars, butcher shops with meat hanging in the windows, more meat than most German families had seen in months. At one station stop, a young American guard, barely older than they were, handed them a canteen of cold water without being asked. It was a small gesture, but for women expecting cruelty, it didn't fit the script they'd been given. Day after day, the train carried them deeper into the heartland. The cities grew smaller. The land grew wider. The heat became a living thing, heavy and wet. Finally, after traveling more than 1,000 miles inside the United States, they arrived at a small Texas town called Hearn. When the train doors opened, the air that rushed in smelled of dust, creosote, and something they couldn't quite name, dry grass baking under an unforgiving sun. Camp Hearn sat 15 miles from the nearest town, a sprawling complex of wooden barracks, guard towers, and barbed wire that glittered like broken glass in the sunlight. By the summer of 1944, more than 4,000 German prisoners were held there, part of the roughly 50,000 POWs scattered across Texas in over 30 camps. The regulations were clear. Prisoners could work, but only under guard, only in daylight, and only on approved tasks. Inside the wire, life followed a rigid rhythm. Morning roll call, thin coffee and army bread. Work details, evening count. It was tight, orderly, and by the standards of wartime captivity, surprisingly humane. But outside the wire, another kind of crisis was growing. Texas was rich in land but desperately short on people. By 1944, more than 1 million Texans were in uniform, fighting in Europe or the Pacific. On farms and ranches across the state, almost every able-bodied man between 18 and 35 was gone. Cotton fields went unpicked. Fences sagged. Cattle wandered through broken wire. One state agriculture report warned that without extra labor, as much as 20% of some crops might rot in the fields. Tom Wheeler felt that crisis every time he rode across his 4,000-acre ranch north of Hearn. Before the war, he'd had his 2 grown sons and half a dozen hired hands to help with the endless work mending fences, checking water tanks, moving cattle between pastures. By 1944, his sons wore uniforms overseas, and most of his cowboys had gone to war plants or oil fields where the pay was better and the work safer. He was a practical man with a sunburned neck and a good horse, but there were more chores than daylight. When he heard that Camp Hearn was sending prisoners out to pick cotton and cut timber, he listened carefully. One afternoon, Wheeler stopped by the county agent's office. The room smelled of old paper and stale coffee. On a bulletin board, among posters about war bonds and ration stamps, he saw a typewritten notice: 12 German women available for agricultural labor under strict supervision. He read it twice. Women. He'd heard of Italian and German men working the fields, but women behind barbed wire, that was something else. That night, over a sparse supper that tasted of rationing, he told his wife Martha. She looked up from her plate. Women? Doing ranch work? Wheeler nodded. I need hands. Right now, I don't have the right to be picky. The next week, Wheeler drove his truck to Camp Hearn, dust boiling up behind the tires. Beside him sat his foreman, a broad man everyone called Dutch, whose family had come from Bavaria 2 generations back. Dutch still spoke German. At the camp gate, a guard checked their papers. The air was already hot, heavy with the smell of sun-baked wood and distant cooking onions and canned meat sizzling in the mess hall. Major Robert Stills, the camp commander, met them inside. His uniform was crisp despite the heat. He walked them past barracks and watchtowers, explaining the rules in a flat, careful voice. Work hours limited by daylight, guards always present, no private contact, no favors. They are enemy personnel, he said, not guests. Finally, in the narrow shade beside the mess hall, Wheeler saw them. 12 women standing in a loose line. Their uniforms hung off them like sacks. cheekbones pushed against thin skin. One woman's arm was in a sling. Another's hands trembled, though the air was still and hot. They looked less like farm workers and more like hospital patients who'd wandered out too soon. Dutch spoke to them quietly in German. They answered in short, tired words. They say they are fit for work, Dutch translated. Wheeler studied them. He thought about barbed wire, about army regulations, about his empty pastures, and about how easily a thin woman could collapse under the Texas sun. Then he made a decision that would break protocol and maybe save lives. He looked at Major Stills and said, "They're too thin to work." The words hung in the hot air. The women thought it was a joke, or maybe a new kind of cruelty. Greta later wrote, "We waited for laughter or shouting. Instead, there was only silence and his troubled face." Major Stills frowned. "They meet the requirements," he said. "Regulations say all able prisoners must perform productive labor." Wheeler nodded slowly. "Maybe so, Major, but you send these ladies into a Texas field for 8, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, and they'll drop before the first fence line gets checked. That's not productive either." There it was, the paradox laid bare. The Army needed them to work. Wheeler needed help. Yet the very hunger that made them seem expendable now made them useless for the kind of heavy labor the rules assumed. Stills hesitated. "Paper orders didn't mention special treatment. What are you suggesting?" Wheeler leaned against the fence post. "Let me take them. I'll sign for all 12. I'll use them on the ranch, but not in the fields. Not at first. I'll get some weight on them, build them up. Then they'll be more use to you and to me." Stills studied him. On his desk were neat files showing how many man-hours of prisoner labor went to county farms every week. It was a simple equation: so many men, so many acres saved. There was no line for healing first. But Stills also knew that sick prisoners meant reports, inspections, trouble. "You understand," the major said at last. "I cannot authorize special activities. Agricultural labor only. Guarded, logged." Wheeler nodded. "I understand, Major. Just put us down for 12 workers." That evening, Wheeler drove home under a red sky. His truck smelled of dust and old leather. Martha met him at the door, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted towel. The kitchen was warm with the smell of beans and cornbread, simple food, but rich compared to camp rations. He told her what he'd seen. The sling, the shaking hands, the hollow faces. "They're supposed to fix my labor problem," he said, "but they look more like they belong in your pantry than my pastures." Martha sat down at the wooden table. Dutch joined them, his big hands wrapped around a coffee cup. The small house grew quiet except for the ticking clock and the faint sound of crickets outside. "They have to work," Wheeler said. "The Army made that clear?" Martha thought for a moment. "They could help here. Cleaning, canning, sewing. God knows I could use it." Wheeler shook his head. "Some, maybe, but I saw their eyes. They're used to doing important jobs, even if it was for the wrong side. Nurses, clerks, radio people. If I lock them in a kitchen, they'll feel like they've been put in a box. That won't build them up. It'll break them different." Dutch cleared his throat. "Back in Bavaria, my aunt said girls learned to ride before they could read proper. Maybe some of them know horses." The room went quiet. Martha looked up sharply. "Why not? You have gentle horses, safe corrals. They could learn to ride, check fences, move cattle. It's real work, but it gives them some control, something strong under them instead of just fear." Wheeler stared at her. Teach enemy prisoners to ride his horses? He imagined the colonel's face. It wouldn't be pleased. "Will the Army approve it?" Dutch asked. "Probably not," Wheeler said. Then he sighed. "But the rules say agricultural labor. They don't say a man has to be the one holding the reins." It was decided over coffee, At a plain kitchen table, a quiet rebellion that would change 12 lives. 3 days later, just after dawn, a military truck carried 12 German women from Camp Hearn to Wheeler's ranch. They expected fields and tools. Instead, they saw a dirt corral with 8 saddled horses standing calm in the morning light. No one moved. Lisa later wrote, "We looked for shovels. Instead, there were animals waiting for riders we did not believe we could be." Wheeler stood with Martha and 2 ranch hands as Dutch translated. "Today you will not go to the fields. First, you will learn to be around the horses. Then, maybe to ride if you wish." The choice itself felt impossible. Propaganda had painted Americans as brutal, yet here an American was asking what they wanted. Greta stepped forward. "I taught riding in Bavaria," she said. Wheeler brought her to honey, a sorrel moiré. Greta touched the warm coat and began to cry. "I remembered who I had been before I was a number." The women learned to brush horses, speak softly, and move calmly. Guards stood outside the fence, but the work inside was slow and careful. Within days, 6 women were grooming, while others watched and learned. The pattern set. 6 days a week, dawn to early afternoon, they fed, groomed, cleaned stalls, and mended tack. The labor built strength instead of breaking them. Within 2 weeks, they began sitting in saddles on a lunge line, finding balance at a walk. Greta moved with old confidence. Martha visited daily with lemonade, teaching braids and small skills. After a month, Lisa asked to ride free. Wheeler saddled Pete, the old gelding. At first she was stiff, but by the 3rd circle she was smiling. "For a little time," she told Martha, "I forgot I was a prisoner." By October they rode in pairs along fence lines, officially logging agricultural inspection. Word of the program spread. One Tuesday, Major Stills arrived with a colonel, who watched in silence before saying, "This is not what I expected." Wheeler said simply, "It works." The colonel approved it with strict records. As days cooled, the women sometimes sang while riding. Small gifts passed quietly. One evening, Greta brought Wheeler a carved wooden horse shaped like honey. "You gave us back our strength," she said. In December, Martha urged a Christmas supper. After long approvals, the colonel agreed under tight rules. On Christmas Eve, the women stepped into the warm ranch house, fire crackling, pine on the mantel, and a table laid with roast chicken, potatoes, green beans, bread, and peach pie, a single night of home in a year of war. Guards, ranch hands, Wheeler's family, and the 12 German women gathered at one table. It felt strange uniforms beside work shirts, German beside English, but hunger softened the room. People spoke in short phrases, with Dutch and a young East Texas guard translating. After dinner, Greta taught Martha a German carol. The women sang first. The Texas guard joined using words from his grandmother. Martha covered her mouth, later saying she forgot which side anyone was on. Lisa wrote, "For one night, the war was outside." By early 1945, letters arrived more regularly. Allied bombers were destroying German cities, and the women learned the truth through ink. Lisa's home in Stuttgart was gone. Her mother survived, her father was missing. Martha held her as she cried. Greta learned the stable where she taught riding had been taken, the horses slaughtered. She went silent for days, then returned to Honey's stall, brushing the moiré until she could speak again. In April, rumors swept Camp Hearn. Germany was collapsing. Towns the women knew fell one after another. "You could feel the air change," a guard said. The women worked harder, checking fences and brushing already clean horses, keeping fear at bay. Lisa asked Wheeler, "When the war ends, what happens to us?" He answered honestly, "I don't know, but you'll be stronger than when you came." By summer, orders were clear. The POW program would wind down. Martha insisted on a farewell supper, simple stew, bread, coffee. The women came in worn uniforms, bringing drawings, careful letters, and small carvings. On their last day, Wheeler bent rules and let them ride one final loop across the pastures. The morning was bright. The wind carried the smell of earth and cattle. Anna wrote, "If I can remember this, I can survive what comes next." Most returned to a shattered Germany. Greta rebuilt a small riding stable in Bavaria and sent letters for years. Lisa became a teacher in ruined Stuttgart, working with orphans. Others married American soldiers, immigrated, or returned to Texas later in life. Anna became an artist, painting German women horseback under Texas skies. Wheeler Ranch worked until his death, keeping their letters and the small carved horse. Historians later noted Camp Hearn's unusual record: healthy prisoners and no escapes. The reason was simple dignity. The women arrived as enemies but left as students, carrying a story of decency in a brutal war, a reminder that kindness can reshape how history is remembered.